This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet.
Aloha, and welcome to the monthly public presentation of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. Since 1990, the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii has been following our mission of promoting human health, animal rights, and protection of the environment by means of vegetarian education, as we've grown to become one of the largest all-volunteer nonprofit vegetarian societies in the nation. We are proud to say that we are celebrating our 25th birthday this year. It is now time for a special guest. We're delighted to have with us tonight Alan Goldhamer, DC. Dr. Alan Goldhamer, co-founder along with his wife, Dr. Jennifer Marano, has been the director of the True North Health Center over 30 years. True North Health Center is an integrative medical facility in Santa Rosa, California, with a staff of 50, including doctors of medicine, osteopathy, naturopathy, chiropractic, acupuncture, and psychology. Its 59-bed inpatient facility specializes in medically supervised fasting and has supervised the care of over 15,000 patients. The affiliated True North Health Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit foundation involved in public education and clinical research. His presentation tonight is entitled Fasting, a modern application of an ancient practice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Goldhamer.
Welcome.
Thank you. Just about everybody I see wants to live a long life, but nobody I see wants to grow old. And it's because aging has become associated with pain and debility and dependence. We spend almost $3 trillion as a nation on healthcare, but unfortunately the results are not as good as any of us would like. If you look at the statistics, you realize that adults today live little longer than adults did in 1900. Now, most people believe that because life expectancy has gone from 47 to 78, an increase of 31 years, that means adults are living longer, but it's not true. An adult 65 years old in 1900 could expect to live 12 additional years. Today it's 19, that's a 7-year increase. Adults at 85 can expect to live just 2 years longer than they did in 1900. So if life expectancy has gone up 31 years, but adults are only living little longer than they did at the turn of the century, where's the difference? Where is that 24-year difference? It's a difference that's brought about because of a dramatic reduction in infant mortality. Although 160 plus babies per thousand would die in 1900, today less than 7 per thousand die, which means we're not killing our infants with waterborne illnesses because of improvements in hygiene. And for every child that doesn't die in infancy and instead lives to adulthood, you add 78 man years to the average, it shifts the curve to the right. The fact is, the vast majority of the difference in life expectancy is brought about because of this reduction in infant mortality, represented here by green. Adults live, represented by blue, only a little longer. And it's because if you're expecting the miracles of modern medicine to allow you to live a long and healthy life as an adult, you're going to be unfortunately disappointed. The miracles of modern medicine that we typically think of, probably the most profound of which was the introduction of intravenous fluids around 1911. That was important because in a time when if somebody became ill, say for example with an infectious disease, if the body didn't have enough time to fight off that infection, the person would succumb. Once we introduced intravenous feeding, the cause of death, the dehydration that's often associated with febrile illnesses, was able to be deferred. The body was given a chance to heal. It wasn't until around 1937, when sulfa drugs were first introduced, 1940 penicillin was first introduced, that we had a specific exogenous tool for dealing with infectious disease. By that time, this reduction in infant mortality had already long since taken place. It wasn't the miracles of modern medicine, it was in the improvements in basic hygiene that resulted in such a dramatic increase in life expectancy. Improvement in water and food sanitation, reduction in malnutrition, reduced overcrowding, and interestingly enough, less deadly medical care was all necessarily helpful at allowing life expectancy to increase. Anthropologists tell us that in the time that humans have been on the planet, there have been 109 billion of us. Today, there's 7.3 billion or so alive. We have well-documented evidence that exactly 5 people have lived to be 117 or older. So your odds of beating that are about 1 in 20 billion right now. Much better chance that you're going to live somewhat less than 117. The point I'm making is that maximum human lifespan is largely determined the day you're born. At least with today's technology, you're unlikely to be exceeding that maximum potential. However, what may be more important than absolutely how long you live is how well you're going to live in the time that you're alive. Healthy life expectancy is different than life expectancy. Life expectancy, the absolute period of time you're going to live. Healthy life expectancy, how long you're going to live fully functional. The average person in an industrialized country spends 9.4 years in debility. 9.4 years in debility. And we spend between 15 and 18 years not in good health. What's happening is people are continuing to live to quite advanced ages, but they're not necessarily living well. And in the United States, if you compare life expectancy or healthy life expectancy, you find we're not doing very well compared to virtually all the other developed countries in the world. We should also differentiate the things that kill you from the things that debilitate you. You know, causes of disability among adults, in contrast to death, include things like arthritis and back pain and heart trouble and respiratory, mental problems, diabetes. These conditions may not necessarily cause you to die immediately, but they can absolutely debilitate you. As far as top cause of death, we all know now that cancer, heart disease, and stroke lead the list of the actual things that are put on the death certificate. But we should differentiate leading causes of death, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, from actual causes of death, which is tobacco use, poor diet choices, physical inactivity, and alcohol consumption. The things that are actually causing people to die is different than what are identified as the leading causes of death. If we look in 1900 again, if we go back, we notice this big green area here represents infectious diseases. Understand that was mostly waterborne illnesses. So improvements in public hygiene dramatically reduced the incidence of infectious disease deaths. However, heart disease and cancer have more than taken over. It's important to know that as far as determinants of percentage of mortality, the things you can do something about are the dominant factors. Behavioral choices lead that list. If we look at ultimate causes of death again, we notice that the thing at the very, very tip of the list is tobacco. Tobacco use still is the dominant contributing cause of death and disability. It's because tobacco does such a fabulous job of impacting virtually every organ system in the body. You know, it's not just your lungs that tobacco use devastates. For example, they say 80% of smokers will never get lung cancer. How bad can it be, right? It's because they die of heart disease before they live long enough to grow the tumors. Keep that in mind. Number 2 on our list here is blood pressure, and blood pressure is interesting because it causes almost exclusively its damage in the form of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes. Next, you'll notice alcohol on the list. Now, if you listen to the media today, you'd think alcohol was some kind of health food. Think if you don't drink now, you ought to start, right? Good for your heart. They'll talk about Resveratrol being an antioxidant in red wine. Maybe that's a justification to drink it. The fact is it's found in the skin of grapes. You could just eat some grapes and get all kinds of Resveratrol, but no, they're going to try to justify this fact there's a trace amount of this material left in the highly processed wine as some justification to pretend that it's good. They'll also tell you that wine, like aspirin, has a pharmacological effect to thin the blood, and it's true. If you're on an animal food-rich diet, a diet rich in greasy, slimy, dead, decaying flesh, and you're at high risk for a clotting stroke, and you drink alcohol, you have a slightly lower risk of a clotting stroke. You don't have a lower risk of dying from all causes. They don't mention that you actually have a higher risk of dying from a hemorrhagic stroke, but just not the clotting stroke. So sometimes there's a little disingenuousness behind the promotion. They say that statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. And when they're trying to sell you alcohol as some kind of health food, they're lying. Cholesterol elevation is also an ultimate cause of death, and that's because it's an accurate marker for animal food intake. The more animal food intake you have on average, the higher cholesterol levels. It's not necessarily cholesterol per se that's the only factor, but what it represents. Being overweight, not eating enough fruits and vegetables, independent of these other variables, is an important risk factor, in part perhaps because of the 2,000 phytochemicals that are found in fruits and vegetables alone. Physical inactivity, illicit drugs, and unsafe sex. You'll notice that none of these ultimate causes of death are lack of pills or potions or powders or treatments or stents or any other kind of intervention. These are diseases of excess. These used to be called the diseases of kings, because it was only the wealthy elite kings that could afford to engage in the behavior that caused these problems. And yet today they've become ubiquitous. Today, patients that most doctors see have some version of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome includes abdominal obesity, elevated lipids like cholesterol and triglycerides, high blood pressure, high blood sugar with insulin resistance. This syndrome is the dominant syndrome that's leading to death and disability amongst industrialized patients today. And we are getting fatter, there's no question about it. People in industrialized country are getting fatter by the minute. In 1986, shortly after I started practice, there wasn't a single state in the United States that had over 14% of its people to be obese. That is a 30-pound weight gain over a 5'4" woman as an example of BMI greater than 30. So clinical obesity there was not a single state that had over 14% of its population obese. But by 1997, we had to come up with a new color, because some of our southern states here had managed to achieve 20% of the population achieving the exalted state of obesity. And by 1999, obesity was spreading through the United States. By 2001, yes, another new color. Here in the home of deep-fried ice cream, over 25% of the population had managed to achieve the state of obesity. Not to be outdone a year later, a year later, a year later. And 1 year later, we did finally get the breakthrough everybody was waiting for when we got over 30% of the population to achieve obesity. By 2010, you can see where we were. 2012, notice the optimists at the Center for Disease Control. They didn't know who was going to do it, but they figured somebody was going to break through and to get to 35% obesity, and sure enough, 1 year later they did. And if we look just, for example, at minority populations amongst black, we notice obesity has done an even more effective job of spreading. Today, there's more people in the world suffering and dying from the consequences of dietary excess than deficiency. They say there's differences between Europe and the United States, and it's true, there are differences. Of course, we're talking about dietary differences. I'm proud to say, though, as an American, when it comes to achieving the exalted state of obesity, we're number one. We've done a better job than anybody else in the world at achieving an increase in our strategic fat reserves. And in this worldwide contest, we shine brighter than anybody. You notice down here in Asia, some of these countries only have 3% obesity. It's like they're not even trying. Along with this tremendous increase in obesity has become a corollary increase in the diseases associated with obesity, not the least of which is diabetes. You notice here, there's a tremendous correlation between the increase in obesity and the increase in diabetes. It's almost like there's a connection. So today, to fight this, we're selling health foods, and we're pushing health foods. You know, health foods like olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate, coffee, energy drinks, granola bars, and lots of animal foods. What we need to do, of course, is talk about healthy foods, fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. But apparently there's not as much money in that. So I'm going to show you a clip here. It comes from the Canadian government. I think it's important because it's going to bring home a point that I'm going to be trying to make this evening.
What will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? will your last 10 years look like? Will you be quick enough for a game of tag with your grandchild? Strong enough to embrace every moment? Will you grow old with vitality? Or get old with disease? It's time to decide.
Adopting a health-promoting diet has the most promise. You're not going to live forever, but your chances of living until you die, living until you reach your genetic potential, dramatically increases when you adopt the type of diet and lifestyle recommendations that are discussed by this organization and by myself this evening. Human beings, to understand why this is the way it is, we need to go back and think about where we came from. Human beings evolved in an environment of scarcity. For the vast majority of the time humans have been on the planet, we lived in an environment where it was very difficult to get enough to eat and avoid being eaten. The vast majority of humans ever born on the planet never lived to reproduce, which means they never passed on their DNA, they never passed on their behavioral characteristics. Our ancestors were the few survivors, the ones that managed to get enough to eat, avoid being eaten, and live to reproduce. And you're the end product of thousands of generations of successful survival and reproduction. If even one of your ancient ancestors, if just one of your linear tree had not survived, you wouldn't be here. The characteristics that you possess were the characteristics that allowed our ancient ancestors to survive in this very harsh environment of scarcity. Humans develop tools. They tell us that we've used tools in a sophisticated way for over 1 million years. We've used fire to process our food, to provide light, heat, and protection for over 500,000 years. That's longer than we've been humans in this form. And about 100,000 years ago, when our most recognizable immediate ancestors appeared on the planet, we developed the most powerful tool that the planet's ever seen, and that's the sophisticated use of language. Humans do this language business in a much more sophisticated way than any of the other animals that we're sharing the planet with. That tool allows us to accumulate and pass on information in a geometric fashion. Very, very powerful. Something that could take somebody a whole lifetime to figure out gets passed on in a few minutes just by listening to somebody speak or later by reading their words. But these tools were not enough to allow us to thrive. They were just enough to allow us to survive. For most of human history, there were 50,000 humanoids on the planet. In fact, 70,000 years ago, the human species almost went extinct. After a major volcanic eruption in Indonesia, climatic changes resulted in some very serious situations where less than 10,000 humanoids were left, which is kind of that extinction area. Fortunately for us, we managed to get through that tough time. Here is a representation of a modern human brain. And this is a representation of a human brain from 100,000 years ago, about the time that humans took over for Neanderthals. And you'll notice that they're exactly the same. Because what anthropologists tell us that there's been no discernible difference in just this recent past of 100,000 years since our form of humans have appeared on the planet. And presumably, not only is there no structural changes, but there's presumably no functional changes. In other words, the brain that you carry today is the same brain that our ancestors from about 100,000 years ago possessed. Now you'll notice, if we go back farther, humans' frames and brains were much smaller. Through history, the brains got larger and eventually the bodies got longer, till about here. This is about where Neanderthals disappeared, where our human ancestors became dominant. And you'll notice during that little tiny brief time, remember this is 5 million years to 100,000 years, this is just 100,000 years. This is a geometric, not a linear equation here. So just in this basic little biological drop of time, we've had basically the same human characteristics. Well, this is important because if you think about it, if we took a human baby from 100,000 years ago and you could somehow transform it to today, that baby you would not be able to tell the difference. That baby, because its brain is essentially unchanged, would develop the same characteristics that your children develop today. They'd be just as annoying, when they're kids. They'd be just as obnoxious when they're teenagers. It would be just as problematic all throughout life as your child today. And if you could take one of your children and transport it back magically to 100,000 years ago, they would not be able to tell the difference between your darling little brat and their own darling little brats. Why is that important? It's important because our brains were designed for an environment of scarcity. This is the environment that the brain evolved in for the vast majority of human history. It's only recently that we've transformed the planet we live in to this post-industrial situation. And amongst the changes, we've changed what we put in our mouth. We've changed our diet. But our brains are still designed for the environment of scarcity of our ancient ancestors. And that's why we have problems today that we describe as the pleasure trap. The brain tells the body what to do. How does this large bulbous neuronal net at the end of our spinal column tell the body what to do? It does it neurochemically. It secretes various substances to reinforce the behavior of the body to ensure that we engage in certain behaviors. What behaviors does our brain want our bodies to engage in? It wants us to survive and reproduce, because that's how the DNA is going to get passed on. So in order to survive and reproduce, what do we have to do? We have to feed, and we have to reproduce, right? If we don't feed, we don't get enough to eat, we don't survive. If we don't reproduce, we don't pass on our DNA. Food and sex are the two dominant behaviors that are affected by this neurochemistry. This chemical called dopamine is the way the brain gets the body to reinforce those behaviors. Dopamine is the neurochemistry associated with pleasure. Pleasure. More dopamine, the more pleasure. More dopamine, the more intense the pleasure. So the way the brain got the body to do these behaviors necessary to engage in survival and reproduction, food and sex, was every time you engaged in feeding behavior or sexual behavior, you got a reward. And that reward is dopamine. Food and sex are the only natural stimulants, intense stimulants of dopamine in the body. Food and sex, food and sex, food and sex, unless you're a male human. Then it's entirely different. Then it's sex and food. But whether it's food and sex or sex and food, these are the normal natural stimulants of dopamine. And this system of reinforcing the body when the brain when it got what it wanted, food or sex, worked. Our witness, we're here. Can you imagine, what if our ancestors didn't like to eat? What if they didn't get heavily rewarded for eating? Do you think they would have done all that climbing and chopping and hunting and whatever it is they might have done in order to scavenge enough food? I don't think so. And what about sex? That's even more obvious. You think all that sweating and huffing and puffing would be engaged in frequently enough to ensure reproduction? Not likely. It's because these were heavily reinforced behaviors that we managed to engage in them consistently enough to allow us to survive. But remember, I said that human beings survived largely because we were innovators. We developed things like tools and fire and language. Well, we also discovered that there were certain chemicals, it just so happens, artificially stimulate the dopamine cascade in the brain, just like food and sex. That's one of those chemicals. We drink alcohol because we like the way it makes us feel. It makes us feel a certain way because it happens to stimulate dopamine production in the brain. The problem is it's an artificial stimulation of dopamine. And so what happens is if you keep artificially stimulating dopamine production, you can actually become what's called addicted, where you become physiologically dependent on the effect of this chemical. And we call that addiction alcoholism. And now you not only drink to try to feel good, you have to keep drinking to avoid feeling bad. And actually, the withdrawal is very unpleasant. And so now we've got a situation where this artificial stimulation of dopamine that was designed by the body to favor survival and reproduction is beginning to work against us. And it turns out it's not just one chemical. There's other chemicals that you can take, things like methamphetamines. There's materials you can inject in your veins. There's stuff like this. You know what this is? No, it's not cheese. No, it's crack cocaine. Cocaine is fabulously effective at artificially stimulating the dopamine cascade in the brain. In fact, cocaine is so powerful that if you canalize not that we would do this, but if the people that do this kind of research have canalized the vessel in a rat brain and given it access to cocaine if it presses the light, the rat will continue to press that light till it's dead. It won't stop for anything. It's so reinforcing. In fact, if you quantify what happens from an orgasm in sex and you figure out how much dopamine is secreted, and then you compare it to smoking cocaine, there's 10 times more dopamine secreted smoking cocaine than having an orgasm during sex. Now, I was giving a lecture like this in Los Angeles some years ago, and an older woman, clearly in her late 70s, early 80s, stood up and she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Goldhamer, where do you get cocaine?" That's not the point. Now, if this was the end of the story, we'd just say, look, there's drugs, they can cause addiction, just say no, don't use drugs, and that'd be the end of the story. But it's not, because it turns out there's certain chemicals that you can put in feed that will have the same neurocascade that we get from cocaine and other stimulants. For example, if you give, for example, a rat unlimited amounts of food, it gets to a certain size. You give it its rat chow as much as it wants to eat, it gets to a certain size. But if you put these chemicals in the rat chow, those rats will increase their weight 49% in just 60 days. If you do this to mice, the same thing happens. If you do it to birds, the birds get so fat they can't fly. Now, do you think that these mice here got fat because of psychological reasons? Do you think it's because mommy rat didn't love them enough? Or daddy rat loved him too much? Or he had stress at work? Or do you think it's biological because you artificially stimulate the dopamine cascade in the brain of the rat with these chemicals and it leads to systematic overeating and they get fat? Yeah, it's biological. What's a chemical that you can put in feed that will cause the animal to become obese? How about C6H12O6, this molecule? You all recognize that. Sugar. This doesn't exist in nature in a concentrated form. You have to go to quite a bit of effort to try to make this. You can suck on all the sugar cane here you want, but you don't get this kind of concentrated sugar unless you know how to process it. And today we've been so effective at providing sugar to people that the average consumption of sugar in industrialized countries is 150 pounds a year. Now you got to remember that's an average. I don't eat any of it, which means somebody's taken my share. And one particularly noxious version of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, which is a heavily federally subsidized version that's processed in the liver much like alcohol, we've increased its consumption 1,060% since 1986. But we don't know why our kids and our people are getting so fat. It's a complete mystery. What's another chemical that you can put in feed that will cause animals to become obese? CH3CH27CH, CH2CH27COOH? You all know that, right? Oil. How many of you have ever fallen into an oil pond? This doesn't exist in nature. You have to take this substance, tear apart cells, take out the highest caloric concentrated substance that we know. And what's even worse is we don't just leave it at that. We take this stuff, we heat it up at high temperature, and then we use perfectly good foods like potatoes and use them as sponges to soak up the grease. We call them potato chips and French fries. So instead of eating those kinds of foods, what I suggest you do is just find the deep fryer and stick your head in it and suck, because that's what you're doing when you're eating foods like that. It's affecting our adults, but it's also affecting our children. We're seeing an epidemic of diabetes now. We've gone from 14 to 16%. This is going to be a huge cascading avalanche of disability and death that's about to come upon us. Today, 93% of all of the calories consumed in industrialized countries come from either animal foods, meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products, or highly processed pleasure-trap chemicals, oil, sugar, and added highly processed refined carbohydrates, as well as salt. What we're talking about is adopting a diet that's free of animal foods, but also free of sugar, oils, and salts, sugars including refined carbohydrates. We call it SOS free because SOS stands for the International Symbol of Danger, and it also stands for sugar, oils, and salts. So we want to get a vegan SOS free diet. Coincidentally, the title of my book is The Pleasure Trap. Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness. It's because I believe that the pleasure trap, this artificial stimulation of dopamine in our brain with chemicals, whether it be drugs or chemicals added to our food, is why people are fat, sick, and miserable. It's why we have the metabolic syndrome. It's why you're seeing obesity and hypertension dominating, and it is the factor that has to be addressed if we're going to be successful. Adopting a vegan diet adopts one part of that. It eliminates the animal food, but it's not enough. We have to also address this SOS issue if we're going to be successful. This is a picture of a young girl. She's 5 years old. She was one of 250 million babies born on the planet 5 years ago, and she just coincidentally happens to be my granddaughter. But what is probably the most bizarre statistical anomaly of all time, it turns out that my granddaughter Kate, of the 250 million babies born on the planet, was the cutest one of all. Now, what are the odds of that happening? I mentioned earlier that the high blood pressure was a leading contributing cause of death and disability. This has become so epidemic that if you reach retirement age and you do not yet have high blood pressure, you're abnormal. It is now normal or average to have hypertension by the time you're 65 years old. And the way we deal with hypertension, this epidemic, is with various pills and potions. And what does a doctor tell you when he says, oh, you have high blood pressure, you need to go on medications for how long? For a week? A month? A year? How long do you have to go on blood pressure medications? Your doctor will tell you, for the rest of your life. You're going to have to be on these medications forever. Now, how does your doctor know that you're going to be sick the rest of your life, that you're never going to recover, and you're going to have to be on medications forever? Because he's guaranteeing you that if you follow his advice, that's exactly what's going to happen. And if you have diabetes, you're going to be on medications for the rest of your life. And if you have autoimmune diseases like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, you'll be sick forever. That's the guarantee of medicine today. You'll take your drugs forever. Perhaps there's a different way to look at it. Let's talk about high blood pressure as a good example. Systolic blood pressure is the top number when they measure your blood pressure. It represents the pressure in your blood vessels when the heart contracts. And the bottom number, or diastolic blood pressure, represents the pressure in your blood vessels when the heart's in its relaxed mode. And each of those numbers is a very sensitive indicator of whether you're going to die prematurely. In fact, they're some of our most sensitive laboratory indicators of all-cause mortality. High blood pressure and the conditions related to high blood pressure are the leading contributing causes of death in industrialized society. For example, almost 300,000 people who have congestive heart failure will die from it each year. Congestive heart failure is when your heart muscle stops working properly, so you can't pump your blood. That's why if you lie down, your lungs will fill with fluid and you can drown. That's why people with congestive heart failure have to sleep sitting up, because their heart doesn't function well enough to just keep their fluids. The leading cause of congestive heart failure is high blood pressure. Almost 800,000 people will have strokes this year. Brain attacks where you don't get blood flow through to a part of your brain dies, and you get characteristic deformity and defects that occur from stroke. High blood pressure is the leading contributing cause of stroke. If you don't have high blood pressure, it's very difficult to get congestive heart failure or develop strokes. But most people develop hypertension. There's 38 million visits to physicians. It's a leading justification for prescription medication. And yet drug intervention is largely disappointing, with the only people getting really improved outcomes from medications are people that have the very highest levels of hypertension. They have a slightly lower risk of stroke. But the majority of people that are actually going to die from heart attacks and stroke from high blood pressure don't have blood pressure high enough to justify medication. What do you mean? Well, for example, if you have a blood pressure of 130/88, your physician will not give you medication unless you have end organ target disease, because more people would die taking the drugs than the hypertension. It doesn't mean you're not at risk. You are. You have 5 times the risk of developing a heart attack. But the drugs are so dangerous that you'd actually kill more people with medication use than without. That's how they defined hypertension, the level you could justify the very real risk of hypertensive medications. It's not just chronic cough and fatigue and impotence that's associated with medication, it's also death. But for every point you reduce your blood pressure through diet and lifestyle changes, by adopting a vegan, SOS-free diet, by exercise and getting enough sleep, for every point you drop your systolic blood pressure 1 point, you reduce your risk of all-cause mortality, death from any cause, 1%. All the way down to 90 over 60. Because 90 over 60 is actually more likely to be optimized blood pressure on average than, say, 120 over 80 or 140 over 90 or whatever it is that people are running. 90 over 60 is where most patients adopting health-promoting diet and lifestyle ultimately end up. If you want to lower blood pressure, what can be done? If we're not going to go along with the pills and the potions and the powders, what are you going to do? Well, we know that weight loss is effective. For every kilogram of weight that people lose, there's a 1.6 point drop in systolic blood pressure. A vegetarian high-fiber diet, independent of weight loss, associated with a reduction in blood pressure, as is alcohol reduction, elimination, exercise induction. And although medications are here, they do lower blood pressure an average of 12 points. It's not without its consequences. In other words, chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and death. Sodium restriction is actually more effective even than medication if it's done aggressively. And John McDougall from St. Helena Hospital did a study where we were able to demonstrate an average 17 points by combining those factors. We did a study with T. Colin Campbell, one of my heroes from Cornell University, where we got a drop of an average 37 points in blood pressure. And if we look at just stage 3 hypertension, people who started at 180 or more, their average blood pressure drop was 60 points. Plus, remember, they started on medication, they ended up off medications. So plus whatever effect their medication might have been had, plus 60 points. That's the largest effects that have ever been published in the scientific literature in treating high blood pressure in humans. And that was done at the True North Health Center with T. Colin Campbell. And this study published in the Journal of Manipulative and Physiological Therapeutics, where we took 174 patients with high blood pressure. And instead of telling them that they had to be on drugs the rest of their life, we were able to demonstrate that all 174 were able to achieve blood pressure low enough to eliminate the need for medication. We did a second study looking at those people you can't justify hypertensive medications with because more would die taking the meds than not. And lo and behold, they normalized their blood pressure as well. And fasting that ranged from 5 to 40 days on water only, all the patients that participated in this study were able to normalize their blood pressure as well. And to the degree that they're willing to stick to a health-promoting diet, they can sustain those results. We were fortunate enough to be the recipients of a contract from the International Union of Operating Engineers. These are the guys that you have them here, Local 3. They build a lot of the roads. They're heavily involved in construction. And they're also very powerful in California. And they approached us and they said, hey, we'd like to do something for our union brothers and sisters that are suffering from hypertension and diabetes and costing us a fortune. And we think that getting them healthy might be cheaper than cutting their feet off and dealing with their heart attacks and strokes. And so we thought we would have them participate in your program. We want you to come and present your information. And so we did. Dr. Lyle, our psychologist, and myself went to a meeting, and we presented the results of the data that we had experienced, the studies that we had published. And it was very interesting because, there was representatives there from the union and the union operators and the contractors that hire the union members. They had a representative of the National Institute of Health there who does some calculations. They had an actuary there who calculates the costs of the pension benefits and all the costs of everything for the union members. If a union member manages to survive to retirement, they get a monthly pension benefit until they die. Well, first person that objected to our program was, of course, the contractors. They said, oh gosh, and we already spent so much money on healthcare, we don't want to send them on vacation too. And we explained a little bit about what happens when people undergo fasting at the True North Health Center, and after a few minutes they decided maybe it wasn't actually a vacation. But then more conversations were carried on, and one of the National Institute of Health reviewers said he thought it would actually save money because they were spending so much money treating the consequences of these illnesses. And then the funniest thing was a little guy stood up. He was the actuary, and he'd been punching numbers in his calculator the whole time. And he said, Dr. Goldhamer, if we do this program and it's effective, won't it increase their pension benefits by making them live longer? I was thinking, oh my God, they really think that way. I didn't know what to say, and then I didn't have to say anything because one of the crane operators stood up, and he's a crane operator because his neck's like a lot bigger than my thigh. And he said, listen, little man. He said, you should remember who you work for. You work for us. He says, why don't you calculate how much money we're all going to save when I come back there and break your neck? And then they voted unanimously to make our program a fully covered medical benefit for any member of the union or their family, but they asked us to do a study to find out if it actually saved money. And so we did. We took the first 30 consecutive members from the union. Don't let me forget to tell you about the first one. But we took the first 30 guys, we put them through this program. They were with us 3 weeks on average. We did 2 weeks of fasting, a week of feeding. We evaluated the outcomes. They lost 26 pounds during the 3-week stay. And at 1 year, they were still down 28 pounds, which means they lost a little more, not as much as I might have liked, but they did pretty well. And they sustained the effects on their blood pressure. What the union was excited about was they looked at their cost. Their cost dropped more in the first year than the entire cost of the program. And they went on to do this with us for over a decade. We had dozens and dozens of these members from the union come through, successfully manage their hypertension and diabetes. And it was very, very gratifying. But I do have to tell you about the very first union member that they sent over. He was actually a very large guy who carried a keg around on his belly. He had diabetes, hypertension. His blood pressure was 220, 120. He was on a lot of medications. And he showed up, but they didn't tell him the nature of our program. They didn't tell him he was going to be going to a place and undergoing water-only fasting for a period of 5 to 40 days, going on a vegan, SOS-free diet, learning to exercise, meditate. No. They just said, hey, you can't run the crane anymore. Your pressure's too high. Go to these people, they'll fix you up, and you go back to work. So he shows up, and he says, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I said, well, you're here to get well. And he says, well, I'm not sick. I said, sure you are. He says, no, I'm not. I said, well, you got high blood pressure and diabetes, and you're on 8 medications, and you're going to die. I thought that would infect him. He says, well, don't we all have to die? I said, well, yeah, but I thought this would work. I said, you're on $880 a month worth of medications, and if we get you healthy, you won't need those. And he said, what do I care? My union pays for the medications. And that's when I realized this was not my normal, highly motivated, self-selected, highly compliant patient I was dealing with. And I wasn't sure what to do and what to say, because I had never really had somebody that resistant before. But then I was thinking about his medical history, and you know, males that are on hypertensive and diabetes medications often have a little problem. And I said, well, you know, if we do something about your condition and get you well, I think there's a pretty good chance we can do something about your little problem. And then he started to stand up, and I thought, uh-oh, because he was a pretty big guy. And he said, well, why the hell didn't you just say so? So we're getting ready, we're checking him in, you know. And he was telling me about his diet. His diet was this. Well, it wasn't exactly this. I couldn't find a picture of what he ate. It was this, but without that disgusting piece of lettuce at the top. If they put that lettuce on that thing, he'd send it back and get it fixed. Or at least take the bun up there and get that thing off there. So he was a big triple cheeseburger kind of guy. But we thought we better feed him a little before we start the fasting. You know, these things tend to turn into bricks if you don't move him out first. So I sat him down and started to give him some real food. And he was commencing to try to eat the real food, and I thought, uh-oh, I think we missed in his diagnosis. He must have a massive tumor in his esophagus, because he was like, couldn't seem to get it swallowed, spitting it out all over the table, clearly in distress. I sat down next to him and I said, it looks like you're having a little trouble with the food. And he said, what food? He said, this is not food. He said, this is disgusting. He said, if I have to eat tasteless swill like this the rest of my life, I'd rather just die. He says, why don't you go out to my truck? You can get my 12 gauge when I'm not looking. Just shoot me in the head. So we checked him in. He fasted for 26 days on water. After 26 days, his blood pressure was down, his blood glucose was normalized, and he lost a lot of weight. And we're breaking the fast. We sit him back down to start feeding him again. But this time, it was different, because he was actually able to swallow the food. And when I sat down next to him, I said, well, it looks like you're doing a little better with the food now. He said, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. It took me 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food we had given him 26 days earlier. He said, oh, no, that stuff you tried to make me eat before was disgusting. He said, this stuff here, it's not bad. That's where we got the theme of our food from our kitchen at the center, is where we make good food taste not bad. There is many types of fasting. You'll hear a lot about it now in the popular press, and the reason is there's a lot of money, millions actually, being funded by drug companies to investigate fasting because they know things are happening in fasting where people are getting well. We're going to discuss that. And they want to know where the mechanisms are so they can come up with a drug that does the same thing. They're called fasting mimics, and they're spending millions of dollars on research, some of which is with us at the True North Health Center, trying to identify the mechanisms by which the body heals itself. We're not talking about intermittent fasting, where you might reduce calories to 500 calories once or twice a week. We're not talking about limiting the feeding window where you don't eat before 10 or after 5. All of these are very useful. We can, if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to talk about that as a form of weight loss technique and other things. We're talking about water fasting, medically supervised water-only fasting from 5 to 40 days for the specific results I'm going to briefly discuss here. Water fasting, as I'm describing, is the complete abstinence of all substances except water in an environment of complete rest. It's important that people rest when they fast because even moderate activity doubles caloric and protein utilization, changes the reality of what's going on. Fasting is not starving. Fasting is not starving. Fasting is when you have labile reserves. If you keep fasting long enough, eventually you would use up all your labile reserves, then you would enter a process called starvation, and then you would die. So we don't do that because it would be really lousy on our outcome data. So we've done this for 30 years. We've had 15,000 people undergo this process, and everybody that's walked in for fasting has been able to walk out so far. Even a 70-kilogram male, 154-pound male, could fast up to about 70 days. It's surprising, even in a thin person, how much reserves there are if rest is introduced. The phases of fasting, you all know the first phase, that's the gastrointestinal phase when you use the stuff in your gut. Everybody does that. Once you've used that stuff up, after about 6 hours, you have to mobilize glycogen stores. That's what you do until you eat again. And in fact, if you run a marathon, Ruth, what happens at about 20 miles? You run into something. The wall. That's more or less correlating with depletion of glycogen stores. That's why athletes like to carb load or they do training in order to try to increase their glycogen storage so they can go a little bit farther before they hit that wall. Once you've used your glycogen stores up, there's a process called gluconeogenesis where you break down protein to get the glucose that your brain needs. And then around day 2, day 3, you start kicking in through a process called ketosis where you're able to use beta-hydroxybutyric acid as a primary fuel. Now this is really unusual in humans. Chimpanzees, for example, don't do this. They just keep burning glucose. They can go about a week and then they die. That's why you'll never see chimps migrating far away from the tropics. They can't survive because they can't fast. The only humans that ever survived this migration away from the tropical areas were the ones that happened to have this ability to change fuels, a biofuel brain. Virtually every human being that survives today has the ability to do this. There's 1 in 10,000 that have a genetic defect called MCAD, medium chain acetylcholine A dehydrogenase deficiency, which just means you can't break down fatty acids to glucose. Those people can't fast. It's a rare defect. But everybody else able to fast as far as their biology is concerned. Basically, fasting is about drawing upon your fat stores, sparing your vital proteins, and conserving your nutrients. That's what fasting's about. It was designed to do that. All we've done is applied this ancient practice in a modern situation that has applied it to conditions of dietary excess. Indications for fasting can be the loss of appetite that characterizes acute disease. When people are sick or animals are sick, they often lose their appetite. You can use it in acute and chronic illnesses. You can use it to speed healing. You can use it to change behaviors. For example, quitting smoking. By the end of the second day, people, they don't complain about cigarettes anymore. They don't have any more cravings. Now, some people say they're so miserable fasting, they're not even thinking about cigarettes, but it's not true. These metabolic processes just go through very quickly, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or cocaine. And psychospiritually, isn't it interesting that every major religion has a tradition of fasting? From the Jains to the Jews, to the Catholics, everybody has a tradition about fasting because fasting changes the way you think about yourself and the world around you. You can't help it. The most important part of fasting is actually selecting what we call patient selection, making sure that the person's a good candidate for fasting. You do that with a history exam and laboratory evaluations. This is important. Without having this information, it's very difficult during the fast to tell the difference between a healing crisis, which looks scary but is good, and a problem which is not good. The reason we've been able to do this with 15,000 people successfully, is because we go through this process very religiously. We do a good job of reviewing the history exam, laboratory, and monitoring the patients carefully throughout their stay. They're seen twice a day by staff doctors. We do this very carefully. Now, the experience of fasting is interesting. For example, you'll get a foul taste in your mouth. It tastes very much like something died, it crawled in there and died. It's really interesting. Increased body odor. Sometimes you don't even want to be in the same room with yourself. Fatigue, sometimes profound fatigue, sleep disturbance, restlessness, irritability. I'll tell you what, there's nothing better than being at a fasting facility with 50 people. You take away their cigarettes, their coffee, their alcohol, their food, and they can become very entertaining. Dizziness on arising. We have to train people to get up slowly and move around slowly when they're fasting. Aches and pains. Even things that didn't bother you before fasting might during fasting, particularly chronic injuries become acute. Nausea and vomiting. You dump a bunch of yellow-green bile. That can cause nausea and even sometimes vomiting. Rashes and discharges, stuff coming out of the skin and the mucous membranes. Heightened senses. And the healing crisis where you're pretty sure you're going to die. Something becomes acute in resolution. Now, to people not familiar with fasting, some of you think, well, that doesn't sound very good. That doesn't even sound attractive. Why would I want to do that? And being familiar with fasting, we recognize these are all symptoms that the body generates in an acute attempt to resolve chronic problems, and they're good things. But I understand now, not everybody used to see it that way. And I learned that early in my career when a woman was referred to me by a physician, a local medical doctor, sent in one of his long-standing patients with autoimmune disease. She had rheumatoid arthritis and hypertension, and she was on a lot of medications. And she came in and she said that she loved her doctor and she trusted him implicitly, and he said that I could help her with her problems. And I said, perhaps. She said, my doctor, he likes to kid me. He's a practical joker. He said you were going to put me in a room and not feed me for 2 weeks. She thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard until I told her it would be at least 3 weeks. And she said, 21 days of nothing but water, what would happen to me? And I said, well, first, your mouth will coat up and taste like something crawled in there and died. And then you're going to smell really bad. And then you're going to be irritable and dizzy, and then you have aches and pains and nausea and vomiting and discharges, and you may have a healing crisis where you're pretty sure you're going to die. And then she interrupted me, and she said, well, you're quite the salesman, aren't you? Where do I sign up? So she did a fast of a little over 3 weeks. It ended up being 24, 25 days, I'm not sure exactly, but it was a long fast. Obviously, I'm telling you the story, it was a good outcome. She got off her drugs, she did fine. She goes back to see Scott in his office, and he immediately calls me when she walks in there, and he tells me this is the most amazing thing he's ever seen in 25 years of medical practice. He can't even believe it's the same person that he's known for 20 years. And he says, but the one thing that's puzzling him is she said that we fasted her for over 3 weeks. How did we get her to do it? And I thought I'd give him a hard time. So I said, well, she was so reluctant, we finally realized the only hope was to just tie her up. And he said, you did not. And he turned to her and he said, did they tie you up? And she said, well, no, not till after the second week. He quit his job, he joined our practice till he retired because he wanted to spend the last few years of his life doing something worthwhile. Fasting duration, sometimes it's just a few days, sometimes it's a few weeks, sometimes it takes several fasts, depends on the problem. But the idea is conditions that are caused by dietary excess often reverse themselves in this process of fasting. Now, I've said something a little bit disturbing. I've said that the leading cause of death and disability, like high blood pressure and diabetes and autoimmune diseases, are reversing themselves doing essentially nothing but fasting. What is the possible mechanism? How is it possible doing nothing could allow these conditions that medical doctors will say you can't resolve, you must be on drugs forever, there's nothing you can do, can actually reverse themselves? How is it possible? What percentage of people that go through water-only fasting do you think lose weight? 10%? 20%? 100%. I know it sounds like a quackery thing, doesn't it? 100% effective? But it's true. The laws of physics and thermodynamics tell you that if you don't eat, you're going to lose weight. And weight loss is a pound a day. Natriuresis also happens in everybody that fasts. There's a selective elimination of sodium. So all this excess salt that you've been sucking up gets processed quickly, and the blood volume that goes along with that drops your blood pressure, gets rid of the swelling, the congestive heart failure, the edema. A lot of the non-healing wounds start to heal. It happens in everybody that fasts. Detoxification was the traditional justification for fasting. Are there really toxins in the body? If we liquefy your fat and analyze it, are there really over 200 chemicals that show up in various quantity in virtually every human being on the planet? Yeah, and now they're starting to recognize these chemicals can accumulate in various proportions, interfere with cellular function, are part of the aging process, may lead to cancer and other problems. And now we're starting to recognize that's a big deal. How did those chemicals get there? Well, obviously, if you take drugs or you're exposed to poisons at work, you smoke cigarettes, that's one way. But where does 90% of the total body load of the average human get into the body? How did it get there? It's one behavior: eating animal foods. Meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products biologically concentrate the poisons from the environment. When you eat an animal food, you've taken its entire lifetime accumulation of toxins. Day after day after day after day after day of accumulating materials from the environment, from their diet, from the feed that they're given, the drugs that they're given, the chemicals they're exposed to. They biologically build up and move up and up and up and up in higher and higher concentrations. You kill that animal and eat it, or you drink its milk product, and you get its entire lifetime accumulation. And if you take a human being, liquefy its fat, do a fat biopsy, break it down, figure out how did that stuff get there, you can trace a large percentage of it back to the pernicious behavior of consuming animal foods as part of the diet. For no other reason. Forget about the environmental issues, the ethical, moral, spiritual issues. Forget about all the other issues. Just the one selfish, greedy issue. If you'd like not to become a toxic waste dump, you'd be better off avoiding eating animal food. Multipotential hematopoietic stem cells. These are the cells. You keep hearing about stem cell treatment and all that. So they're trying to come in here and do something about these guys. These are the basic primordial cells that become the immune cells in the other parts of your body. There's a problem because when those age, that was thought to be irreversible, and then that's associated with death and disability. The sensitivity of these cells to things like chemotherapy is why you can't easily cure cancer. If these cells weren't so sensitive, you could go in and give radiation or chemotherapy, wipe out every cancer cell, and everybody would be happy. The problem is if you wipe out every cancer cell, you also kill the host, which is rather inconvenient. And so as a consequence, they've been fighting this battle of how can you poison the body enough to kill the cancer but not kill the host. And they've been dismally failure, except in a few isolated cases of rather exotic cancers. But recently, Walter Longo at USC discovered that if you use fasting, you can profoundly affect these hematopoietic stem cells. You can actually reverse the aging process in these cells with fasting. They've done it in rats. And you can also, the use of fasting protects the healthy cells and makes the cancer cells much more vulnerable. For example, they took rats with cancer, 30 of them. They radiated them enough to kill off the last cancer cells. It kills all the rats. Take the same rats, same dose of radiation, but you fast the rats, they all survive. The fasting induces a protective mechanism that protects the healthy cells. And because cancer cells don't adapt well to a stressful environment because of problems with differential stress resistance and differential stress sensitization. In other words, cancer cells don't adapt because of their higher metabolic rate. You take advantage of that, they don't do well in a fasting state. Healthy cells do better than cancer cells do. So introducing this in conjunction with conventional therapy is shown to be profoundly effective at improving cancer-free survival compared to chemotherapy alone. The mitochondrial benefits, mitochondria are the little energy parts of the cell. They're profoundly infected by changing the cell's fuel to beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which is the fatty acid you produce when you're fasting. So not only does it improve ATP production, but it also enhances antiviral immunity, which may be why we see a lot of these viral infections that won't resolve, that don't respond to antibiotics, because antibiotics are not effective against viruses, and don't respond to conventional medical care, often will resolve in fasting, and it may be in part because of this mechanism. Fasting, we know in lower eukaryotes, if you take a simple-celled organism and put it in a nutrient-rich environment, it lives to a certain lifespan. But if you put it in a nutrient-deficit environment, it'll increase its lifespan 400% because it goes into kind of a hibernation mode. In rodents, we protect against diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and neurodegeneration. And in humans, fasting has been shown to reduce obesity, hypertension, and asthma and RA. Now, this is cited in a new study in Journal of Metabolism 2014 by a guy named Walter Longo I mentioned earlier. I evaluate another person's intelligence by how much they agree with me. So he must be brilliant because he cites my studies as justification for reversing hypertension in human beings. So he's well-read and must be very smart. You can also delay aging by protecting against the disease of dietary excess. What they're discovering, this is all brand new stuff. This is 2014, 2015 in some of the major medical journals in this country. which is why many of your physicians haven't quite heard about it yet. You can actually reverse this process through something as simple as a health-promoting diet and fasting. I'm going to share with you a case report. I'm so excited about this particular case report because this woman was a 42-year-old patient who came to me after being worked up at Stanford Medical Center for 2 years with progressive condition of follicular lymphoma, stage 3. This is a cancer where you get these, she had lemon-sized tumors all throughout her body. They had delayed trying to treat her with chemotherapy and radiation because treatment for this condition sucks. It's not very effective. So they don't rush in and do it because you end up killing a lot of people with treatment and it doesn't really increase all-cause survival. So they had monitored, but finally it got to the point she felt so badly. Her primary doctor was saying, okay, it's time for treatment. She asked her doctor about diet changes. Would vegetarian diet help? He said, no, diet's not related to this condition. It doesn't matter what you eat. Eat anything you want. And so the oncologist at Stanford also said it was time to think about treatment. She asked about alternative treatments. He said there weren't any alternative treatments. She said, what about the people that said fasting could be helpful? And he said, well, there's a lot of criminals and a lot of quacks out there, and you know. So anyway, with that encouragement, she came to our center. She fasted for 21 days. During that 21-day fast, her tumors disappeared. We could not find any trace of any one of her tumors. She refed for 10 days. She went back to the oncologist at Stanford, and she said he did the double take because he was examining her, looking at the chart, looking at the picture on the chart, looking at her, trying to find the tumors, and finally he said, what happened? And she says, well, I went to the criminal quacks and I did the fasting and the tumors all disappeared. And he said, really? Well, I'm going to have to give them a call. And then we had coached her that we wanted her to get a follow-up spiral CT on the same machine that they had done the original diagnosis on, which he refused because he said that she didn't need any more treatment because she was better. And she said, well, she wanted to objectify it, and he said that he would objectify it by telling her that he'd been doing this for 25 years and she was better and she didn't need any more imaging studies. And she persisted, and finally he relented and did the study just to, you know, make her leave. And so anyway, we followed up, we wrote up this report. He assured her, though, that her low count, she still had a low white count, meant that it was going to come back. You can't cure this condition. Don't get her hopes up. But at 2 months and 3 months and 6 months and 9 months, everything continued to improve. And her white count normalized, and now we have a 12-month follow-up. Of course, she's gone from, if you look at the chart, these are the CT scans. You can see the mass here. Disappeared. And here. And if you look at this chart, you'll notice that her weight dropped from 81 kilograms to 59 over the course of 12 months, and BMI dropped. So what has she been doing? Complying. She's been following the diet, doing the right stuff. And so we wrote this up, and we submitted this to the British Medical Journal, because British Medical Journal is one of the top impact journals in the world, and we thought, well, that would be nice if they would publish that. And they accepted it for review, which was interesting, and they sent it to the reviewers, and one of the reviewers said, well, it's really interesting, but I don't believe it. I'd like to see the imaging studies. So we sent these imaging studies here, and then he said, well, that's interesting, and they sent it on to yet another reviewer who's an expert in lymphoma, and after a long battle, they decided that they were going to publish it. And next week, in the British Medical Journals, we will have this report is coming out. So we just got the proofs. It looks really good. They didn't screw it up. And the best part of it was, before I sent it to BMJ, I asked my colleague, Dr. McDougall, what he thought about that. And he said, no, that was a waste of time. They'd never publish it. And you got to be realistic and send it. And he gave me some other places to send it. So I sent it anyway. And so then I got to write him a letter and say, oh, John, by the way, you know. He said, well, it's hard to believe. That was the best part. Well, I guess her getting well was good too. Okay. Other fasting mechanisms, enzymes are induced in fasting. How do these detoxification processes happen? There are enzymes that are kicked in. Enzymes are also used to mobilize fat. Like, how do you take your fat and burn it? You need lipolysis, you need enzymes. They're induced in fasting. So it doesn't happen just when you're fasting. You induce those enzymes, but they persist. And every time you fast, it's just like being a trained athlete. You get better and better and better at it. Fasting's cumulative. And so you're detoxing better now, but also next year and later. And so we believe that this whole process is one of inducing both fat mobilizing, nutrient mobilizing, and detoxifying enzyme systems. The brain-derived neurotrophic factor is the brain factor that's associated with protection against Alzheimer's disease. This is the neurotransmitter that's thought to be, or neurotrophic factor that's thought to be protective. People that exercise regularly, they notice have lower Alzheimer's and demential incidence than people that don't. And people that exercise have much higher levels of BDNF. It turns out that the other thing besides exercise that's been shown to induce BDNF is fasting. People that fast induce this enzyme system. It mediates exercise and fasting-induced enhancements of synaptic plasticity and neuronal resistance to injury. And it also helps regulate autonomic control of the cardiovascular system and appetite. It turns out that there's things like leptin that are induced that are associated with appetite control. You think after fasting you'd be ravenous and you want to eat everything. It turns out no. Your ability to regulate and eat to maintain your optimal weight is much better after fasting than before fasting, because perhaps in part because of normalization of these neurotrophic factors. Insulin, the hormone that drives sugar from your bloodstream into your cells, if you're in diabetes, they actually have enough insulin, they just doesn't work. In type 2 diabetes, there's actually more than normal insulin, but there's resistance to it because the diet you eat that makes you fat also causes insulin resistance. And so when you fast, insulin resistance is reversed. There is no drug that reverses insulin resistance, but fasting does. And so that's why a large percentage of our diabetic patients are able to achieve normal blood sugar levels without the use of medication. Now, they have to do dangerous and radical things if they want to maintain it. They have to keep eating well and exercising. Plus, going to bed on time helps too. But if they're willing to go really outrageous and do something that radical, they can get well oftentimes. There's a tunnel that goes through your body. If you swallow something, you're under the illusion, probably, that it's in your body. It's not. You swallow something, it's going through your body. There's a tunnel that starts in your mouth, it goes down the esophagus, it goes through the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. Eventually it makes its way down to the rectum, and then there's this little hole at the end called the anus. And digestion is really nothing more than shoving stuff in one hole and then trying to push it through the other hole. It doesn't get in your body unless it gets absorbed through the intestinal mucosa, represented here by this mesh. In other words, it works much like the screen that works with flies. The flies can't get through unless the holes are damaged. Stuff can't get through into your body unless the holes are damaged, unless it's a glucose or an amino acid. Even a protein molecule is too big to absorb through the intestinal mucosa unless it's damaged. What could damage your intestine? How about something called free radicals? Do free radicals damage the body? Sure. Have you noticed the difference between a smoker and a non-smoker? They call it smoker's face. Have you ever noticed that? Somebody smokes like you can look and see that they're cross-linkaging of their face. That's what wrinkles are, is cross-linkaging of collagen tissue from free radicals, premature aging. Do you think it's just the face that's affected by smokers or the inside of their blood vessels? Right. That's why they don't get cancer as much as they would otherwise, because they die from heart disease because they damage the inside of their blood vessels. You could look like this in just a year and a half. Wouldn't you like that? All you have to use is methamphetamines, another really good source of free radicals. The autonomic nervous system controls the part of your body that you don't think about. Like, for example, if you go running, do you have to tell your heart to speed up, or does it do it automatically? It's automatically done by the autonomic nervous system. If you didn't do that, you would die. This does it automatically, but it can become out of balance. What if the sympathetic nervous system is too high? You might have a symptom called constipation. What if the parasympathetic is too high? You might have a symptom called diarrhea. Okay? There's lots of pains and problems we get when the autonomic nervous system is out of balance, and we've discovered hundreds of healing systems to get it back. What do we call those things? How about meditation and yoga and chiropractic manipulation and physical therapy and homeopathy and all these natural therapies? They all have one thing in common. They rebalance the autonomic nervous system. Some work better than others. The one that works the best is fasting. Psycho-spiritual, we've mentioned already. Every religious has a tradition. The immune system is actually enhanced. The objective measures of the immune system are enhanced during fasting. And perhaps most important of all, for our purposes, is taste notation. Remember my union guy? He couldn't stand the taste of good food. It was disgusting, tasteless. Surely he wouldn't have eaten even one meal if I sent him home with instructions. But after fasting, what happened? He neuroadapted. Good foods taste better. If you're used to salty, greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh foods, nothing tastes good except salty, fatty, slimy, greasy, dead, decaying flesh foods. Good foods are disgusting or tasteless. You can't imagine how anybody could choke the swill down. But once you get on a good diet, for example, if you're on a low-salt diet, it takes about 30 days. Neuroadapt to low-salt diet. On a high-fat diet, it takes about 90 days to neuroadapt to a high-fat diet, where you'll feel satisfied on a healthy diet. With fasting, it can happen much quicker. So these are the mechanisms by which we believe that fasting happens. And I'll summarize here. I know I'm probably long out of time. But fasting decreases glucose and insulin growth factor 1, which is the factor we've identified associated with aging. It decreases blood pressure and heart rate and insulin. It reduces inflammation. It drops the total microbial load, the bacterial load in the gut. It increases leptin, which is the satiety hormone, so you feel full easier. It increases insulin. It increases cellular stress resistance and adaptation. It increases autophagy, where the body eats up bacteria and viruses and things it needs to get rid of. It normalizes the gut microbiota. It stimulates B-cell immunity, and it reverses all major abnormalities of metabolic syndrome, which I mentioned earlier. It is really quite remarkable how effective doing nothing can be when you do it intelligently. For those of you that might want to learn a little more of this, you might want to read The Pleasure Trap. This is a very disturbing book. It does not tell you what you want to hear, but it does tell you what you need to know if you want to get and stay healthy, and the last third of it's on fasting. It's my favorite book. And I'm not just saying that because I helped write it. It's because it's my favorite book. We have 2 cookbooks, the Health Promoting Cookbook and the Bravo Cookbook. Unique about these books are they're vegan and SOS free. If you want simple recipes, I mean simple, even I can make these things, that are free of the use of sugar, oil, salt, no gluten, no flour, nothing you shouldn't be using, all from whole foods, but still look and taste good. These are 2 useful books, the Health Promoting Cookbook and the Bravo Cookbook. If you want to learn about this stuff, you can go to our website at healthpromoting.com. We also offer something to you that's quite useful, I think. If you go on our website and fill out what are called the registration forms, which gets me your medical history, you can call me and I'll offer you a free phone consultation. You can call me, I'll be happy to go through what you're doing, what you might be doing, anything that I can help you with. Doesn't cost you anything. It's a service that we offer. But you do fill out those forms first in line so we can get your medical history information and not have to spend a half hour asking you questions that you won't need. We don't need to do. Also, if you're a physician or you're in school for medicine, chiropractic, naturopathy, or you know somebody that wants to do something worthwhile with their life and actually gets people well, we offer free training to physicians. They can come for 1 month, 3 month, or 1 year. We offer internship and residency programs where they come in, we teach them how to get people well. There's no cost to them for any of this. We support them and feed them while they're there. And then we're trying to encourage people to go out and start offering these services in the community. We have a 501c3 nonprofit foundation called the True North Health Foundation. It's involved in public education and research, particularly if you know people that are interested in doing worthwhile research. We're actively collecting a team right now. We've got some fabulous new people. We've got a lot of data that will be coming out, including next week in the British Medical Journal. All of our papers, research is freely available on our website. You can log on. We have the Learning Channel. We have the True North TV, a lot of video links. And again, you can call anytime with any questions, and if I have any time left, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah, the question is, does your BMI have to be below 21 or some arbitrary level in order to be able to be healthy? And what was the second part again?
Is it inevitable with age that your blood pressure will rise?
No, there's absolutely no truth to the idea that increasing blood pressure is a normal part of aging. In fact, Dr. Campbell points out in his study in China, people on plant-based diets that are not able to afford access to large amounts of animal food, that their average blood pressure is often 90/60 at age 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. It doesn't really change with aging. That's a phenomena of premature aging associated in the United States. And our patients often end up back down in that healthy range and are able to sustain that even into their 9th decade and later. So blood pressure elevation is not an inevitable consequence of aging. And there's no arbitrary BMI that people have to achieve in order to maintain optimum health. It's really more the diet that's going to be predictive than what their absolute cholesterol or their absolute weight is. Although, generally, maintaining elevated percent body fats is thought to be health compromising. And really, it's kind of not going to happen. You're not going to maintain obesity on a vegan, SOS-free diet. If you're a woman, you're going to struggle more, say, for example, than men, because women are energy-conserving fat storage devices, and they have estrogen, which is designed to store fat to survive a period of biological vulnerability called what? Pregnancy, because goodness knows men don't have babies, and women do, and it's a good thing. Because if men had babies, there never would have been a second birth, ever. And we would only have about 12 babies born on the planet a year, and therefore the species would have long since died out. So women had to be able to store more fat than men. That's why women say they can walk by the buffet table and gain a pound. a bad dream's worth of dress size? Because they have estrogen. Estrogen stores fat. If you inject men with estrogen, we get fat. We grow breasts, we get hips. If you inject women with testosterone, they lose their fat. But then they get hairy and get cancer and die, so it's not a really good weight loss strategy. But the point is, if you're a woman, you know you have to work harder. So those last few pounds, even on a vegan SOS-free diet, you may have to do additional game playing in order to get that heroin addict svelte look that some women think they're looking for. And as a consequence, that's where intermittent fasting comes in, where you don't eat before a certain time or after a certain time, or you might do 1 day a week where you reduce your calories to 600 calories to facilitate maintaining that very, very svelte balance that some people are looking for. And now, is it that much healthier to not have that last? I don't know. You know, that's we can debate that. But the idea being, you can control this by controlling what you put in your mouth. And you can control what you put in your mouth by limiting your diet to plant-based foods, exclusively plant-based foods that are free of oil, salt, and sugar. Right, so very good question. What happens to people when they come to the center? First thing is, before they come, we do a free screening on the phone, so we review their medical history, make them a good candidate. Then they come in, they're going to see one of our physicians. We have 4 medical doctors, we have 2 naturopathic physicians, we have all kinds of doctors on staff, and they're all not idiots, which is really a novel experience for many people. So we have physicians that are not idiots. They go through a review history exam, come up with a game plan. You never know exactly what the ideal amount of fasting is until you see how the person fasts. While they're fasting, they're seen twice a day by staff doctors. So we're examining the patients. They have 3 educational programs a day that we encourage. They're voluntary, but we encourage them. 10 a.m., 2 p.m., 6:30 p.m., everything from yoga, meditation, body use, cooking classes, lectures, a whole brainwashing campaign. Plus we have 50 DVDs or program DVDs people go through in between classes at their own pace in the interest that they're interested in. And then as they come off the fast, they're engaging in exercise and fitness training. We've got a wonderful staff of educators, and so that you really get, it's called a residential health education program. Because what we want people to do is understand, not only just get well when they're there, but then maintain the program when they go home so they make us look good. Because we're looking for long-term outcome data. So the education is a critical part of what we're doing. And you know, we see people sometimes that are very sick. Sometimes they're there a week, sometimes a month, sometimes a year or longer. We see people that are very healthy that just come in once a year to get an exam because they like to have a doctor that's not an idiot, help them kind of interpret stuff. Or they're businessmen, because our price point's very low. At $149 a night, they get the whole program, whereas that costs more to stay in the hotel. So they're in town doing business, they'll stay with us just because they get their meals and it's a more affordable place to hang out. So because of the way the place is operated, there's some flexibility. People can stay as short or as long as they want. There's no program, they're not locked into something. They just do whatever it is that's appropriate for them. And the thing is, we specialize in treating people that are going to get well. So our focus is trying to select people not only can get well, but have the capacity to stay well. That means they're willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat good, exercise, go to bed on time, and if appropriate, fast. Okay, so we're out of time. Again, if you have any questions, I'll stay around afterwards. You can ask me anything that I didn't get here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, mahalo to all of you for coming, and have a safe return home. Good night, everyone.